Rupert, thank you very much that you joined the podcast. I'm delighted to have you and to be able to interview you about your book, Lost in Transformation.
Thank you, Dirk. Pleasure to be here.
Super. Well, I really love the book because it touches on a lot of aspects having to do with change and transformation that I'm sure I'm sure a lot of listeners and viewers are interested in. Um, I guess my first question would be, in your book, you cite a well-known McKinsey statement that 70% of change projects fail. What do you think is the number one reason for this? And what is the single most important thing companies must get right to prevent this?
Yeah, thanks, Dirk. So, interestingly, that fact, or so-called fact, of 70% of change projects fail is highly contested in the sort of the academic
Yeah.
and the change world, and I found it quite interesting that people were frustrated at show me the evidence, show me the proof of the 70%, because my sense was, well, whether it's I can find the evidence or not, it feels about right. My experience as a practitioner
Yeah.
feels like we get it. We don't quite get it as right as we'd like more often than not. So yeah, sure, 70% is about there. And the inquiry was to try and understand what are we doing here when we talk about leadership, when we talk about change, and what could we do to get better. And I think some of the frequently sort of made mistakes um, are often that we do sort of this change planning in isolation, as I described, with the usual suspects behind closed doors, really with the concept of doing change to others. So very much from our own perspective, and often with reasons such as confidentiality or conflict aversion, preventing, psychologically at least, preventing us from being a bit more inclusive and transparent in that. And then as I work with clients and CEOs and leadership teams, what I find often is they haven't really taken that sort of reflective moment to say, how does change happen here? In our context, with the sort of the dynamic that happens wherever we are working, what works, what doesn't work, and how might we actually do this differently?
Mhm.
And all too often, change is done from a sort of reactive, with haste, with a little bit of anger and frustration, from behind closed doors, and then launched and imposed on an organization. And that just seems all too often the case. So really, if you say, I mean, it's very hard to say what's the one thing, but I think within the answer of what's the one thing, it's around a reflection and awareness of what changes and what works, and within the context of how does it actually happen here, because every organization is different,
Yeah.
and the dynamic evolves. So even if you were to, if you know a company well, if you leave it for a couple of years and then return, some things are similar, some things have moved on.
Yeah.
Similarly, the right way now might be different than it was a couple of years
Yeah.
ago. So I'm trying to encourage that reflection, really. And you find most teams haven't stopped and paused and asked the question.
Yeah. No, yeah, I fully agree with you because years ago, I think about almost 17, 18 years ago, I wrote an article called "Less is More," and that is all about change. And then basically my basic stance in that article was that it's better to do a limited number of change initiatives and do
Mm,
them really well then embark on a number of change initiatives which you kind of are executed in a haphazard way because that's the quickest way to reach the 70%. But what I also wrote in that article, and and you resonate with that one, is the whole contextualization, in the sense of
mm,
what has worked in our history, what is our culture, and how can we contextualize this change so that it kind of ultimately it kind of optimally basically connects and fits in our company culture, so that we also have the optimal chance of realizing it, other than basically using a kind of blueprint or template to apply this change. So I love the element of contextualization. Thank
mm.
you.
That's good.
Yeah. Hey, the other thing is in your book you make a deliberate difference between change and transformation.
Mm.
Um, what do you see as the essential difference between those?
Yeah. So I told myself, Dirk, when I wrote this book, try not to use the word transformation at all. And lo and behold, it's now on the front cover.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah. Lost
I
in
didn't do
Transformation. Well, beautiful, catchy title. So
so I didn't do a very good job because I mean I think my take is slightly irreverent. I mean I like to poke fun at the absurdity of what we do for a living, whether that's leadership or change management or whatever it might be. And transformation for me fits right in that sort of absurdity space. Uh, I do define early on in the book, I define change as being broader than just the thing that's changing at work that the project management office is rolling out. And I want it to sort of encompass the whole sort of human side of what's going on for an individual. And the idea that there's multiple things hitting you simultaneously, some you're aware of, some you're not even aware of. If I give you an example of me right now, I'm 49 years old, about to turn 50. That's got a psychological impact on me. I know it. My eldest child has left to university, so there's an empty nest dynamic going on for me personally. And I'm transitioning from corporate life to self-employed life. And that there's a lot of depth if we start to unravel and unpick each of those things. There's a lot going on for me personally. So, but then when you put me in the context of an organization, and let's say you restructure half of my job or something like that, that's just one tiny element of everything that's impacting me as a human being. And I often say that change is happening anyway, and transformation is often what we call it when we try and do it deliberately and intentionally. So my joking sort of definition of transformation is like change, but bigger and better.
yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, because I think the word transformation has a very bad reputation in the business world
yeah,
nowadays. I think transformation projects, were supposed to reinvent companies, functions, business processes, but more often than not nowadays, they are immediately associated with let's say job losses. So all the parts about reinventing or reinvigorating the spirit or the culture of an organization. I think that is kind of largely disappeared, and therefore it has a bad reputation. Should we perhaps look for another label?
yeah. I'm not sure if we need another label, um, but I agree with your sentiment about the reputation of transformation. I would actually draw a distinction. I think there are some organisations that are tired of this language, and I think there's many organisations that have not even woken up to it yet.
Hmm.
So we've got to remember sort of the spectrum in which we operate, and a lot of what's written about change, I would say, is almost written from the privileged end of the telescope, right? So it's like let's consider all the different types of work that there are out there, and think of transformation more broadly. Um, but I actually almost think that you know, do we need a new label, or do we just need to have a bit of a re-examination of what is this thing that we call leadership? Because
Hmm.
a lot of it comes down to the expectations of what we even think our job is about.
Yeah.
And again, context really important here. But if you're hired by private equity to drop into a recently purchased company and change its fortunes, there's a good chance you've got transformation on the tip of your tongue. That's why you were hired. You're hired for
Yeah.
impact and results, and you're probably going to go about it some way looking like a playbook for change and transformation, right? Whereas there's many other approaches to leadership, but it just seems that increasingly people almost think, and I did quite a big inquiry in this in the book, was what do you actually think your job is? And some people would say things like, well, if you're not managing change, are you really leading at all?
Yeah, that's a very
Um,
good question. Yeah.
yeah, but I always
Yeah.
think we put ourselves on a pedestal as leaders. It was like, I must be showing impact, I must be showing change, I must have something to talk about.
Yeah. There must
I
be a
want,
little bit of theater and
yeah,
yeah, yeah, big gestures. Yeah.
but then you also do find leaders that sort of seemingly go about it in a very quiet and understated way, and are still able to transform. Oh, sorry, I just used that word again, but just improve the fortunes of their organization.
Yeah.
So I don't think everything has to look the same way. And I interviewed people from companies who had different approaches to this. Some had a sort of strictly no consultant model. Others had a strictly yes, it has to be consultant enabled and structured from head office, from the control tower, etc. So there's many different ways to to go about this. But I think in many ways there is a real opportunity for a slightly refreshed and more sort of humanistic approach to how we do this.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. But one of the fundamental questions I have, and it goes a little bit back to my opening question, change management concepts and models, and you mentioned a number of them from William Bridges and Kotter and a number of others in your book. They have been around for decades. And also structured change management methodologies like ProSci also have been around for a long time.
Mm.
What do you think is the reason that we still struggle so much in the area of change management?
Yeah. So my arrival at this sort of inquiry was from a slightly different angle. So I've never had a job called change management.
Mm-hmm.
I've never qualified in any of the frameworks of change management. I've worked very closely with people who have. And one of my realizations is the problem isn't the model per se, the problem is the attention the insights receive. And it's often buried, um, in slideware or lower down in organization. So it very rarely do those good intentions and good plans infuse, the leader's approach. And actually, in some ways, I have a lot of sympathy for it. So I learned more about change management in the writing of the book than I did in my organizational life per se.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
what I did understand, what I learned a lot in my organizational life was how leaders think, and they don't really think about change management models. And actually, if you ask them what they do think and how they think change happens, they might reference something they read in an airport book or on an MBA course a long, long time ago. And what struck me as fascinating was the most frequently cited model was Kotter's 8-step
yeah,
change model. And
yeah,
typically they could remember 3 or 4 steps. So there was
yeah.
always going to be a burning
The burning
platform.
platform. I was going to say that's the
Yeah,
one that's always there. Yeah, yeah,
we
yeah.
could remember the burning
Yeah, the
platform,
burning platform. Yeah, yeah,
and the case for change, and maybe some
yeah,
quick wins, and then we were a little bit running out of steam, and that it's important, I think, to know to meet your client where they are. That's a little bit the level of empathy and awareness that exists. But then if you start to have a conversation about what works, what doesn't work, what were the best change programs we ran, what were the worst, there's lots of deep, rich insight because everybody lives that,
yeah,
year in, year out. So I what do I think about the change management sort of area? I mean, I almost want more people to share that interest in what it means to do it well. But I don't. I think change management sort of has become a bit of a function of its own. It's become a discipline of its own that's in danger of just getting sort of like suppressed in organizations.
hmm
Um, and there's lots of it in big organizations. You look at organization design, or organization development. Almost like ironically, two well-intentioned but slightly different teams with the same name.
yeah,
So this happens a lot. I think the answer really is what actually gets the attention of the leadership or those that are making decisions. That's the most important thing. And if some of that is a bit change managementy, then that's great.
yeah. What I what I said in our conversation before we started to record a podcast is what I thought was a very very powerful concept in your book is the fact that you highlight the in-group behavior that change teams often develop. Um, both you and I have been members of an infinite number of change teams, and as you already write in your book, it already starts as selection, right? A change team often consists of people without actual skin in the game. If anything, they probably benefit from, let's say, the change that are going to execute. The question is, in order to prevent this kind of, in-group, out-group type of behavior, what should the composition of a credible change team look like? And how should let's say a change team behave in order to be accepted by the organization, which is quite often a prerequisite for being effective?
Well, those questions are too big, Dirk. I mean, they're huge. I mean, they're brilliant questions. I reflect on a couple of different experiences. So if I think back, and what was interesting, what I didn't really realize until I started doing the book was that my opinion on what good change and leadership looks like was actually formed very early on in my career. So it was probably the first 10 years of my career where I was and the big empathy raising experience for me was being acquired.
Yeah, you wrote that
Which is
about
very,
Gillette in the time that it was taken
yes,
over by Procter and Gamble. Yeah, yeah.
and being acquired is very different than acquiring. Um, and what was very interesting about that acquisition was that they did it with no consultants, and that the clean teams, it was structured on the basis of a merger, although it turned out not to be quite a merger, but still the way they constructed the clean teams was representatives from both companies coming together to plan the future organization. So to your point about skin in the game, very different. Everybody there has got skin in the game. Everybody there wants to create something that they what ideally want to be and will be a part of in the future, and they want to respect and recognize the people that they're representing. You know, so for me,
Yeah.
I'm doing this on behalf of Gillette. I have to fly the Gillette flag and think about the future combined company.
Yeah.
And so loads of skin in the game. Now you could argue, yes, but Rupert, you've got empathy. You're coming from inside the business and you're working on the future, but you're not really qualified. You know, you haven't done any change management education. You're not a consultant.
Yeah.
You know, all you're bringing in is subject matter context.
Yeah.
But a lot of trust. You've got a network. You understand what works. A lot of cultural insight. But I think actually, in some ways, that model worked quite well. It's also unrealistic to structure change like that all the time. I mean, P&G diverted a lot of resources away from other acquisitions onto that acquisition at a cost to them. You know, some of the if I think of the Weller acquisition that was mid-flight at the time that they were doing Gillette, Weller never got integrated. The resources were diverted away,
Yeah.
and there's a consequence to that. You know, so you don't have the luxury of having all these spare executives that you can put on work streams on top of the day job or instead of the day job. So I think you end up with a hybrid model that looks like, you know, internal consultants, external consultants, and people from the client system working together on it. And I suppose what works well is having people, and I talk about this, what's the ideal qualities of like a chief transformation officer. And a lot of people will say, oh, please don't, make sure it's an internal person who understands the business. But at the same time, make sure it's somebody who can understand the future of the industry, has you know, in today's world, they probably can join some dots. Maybe they've worked in a couple of functions. They understand where the customer is going, technology's role, etc. But they also have that sort of like ability to be able to make things happen, whether it's through influence, whether it's through sort of trust or confidence. There's so many qualities that a really great sort of change leader brings. And invariably, when you're putting teams together, you don't have a perfect candidate, right? So you're left trying to patch it together with whatever you can find. And my learning that I talk about in the book, when you get too many very sort of bright external profiles, and even when you hire them, make them internals, when you put them together, you very easily create the in-group, out-group dynamic.
Yeah.
Which is people who are hired really for a mission, which is to change the fortunes of the business. Their skin in the game is not really about that company's long-term success. It's more about their change program's short-term success, because they might see themselves as change professionals, or maybe they've got a background in consulting, maybe it's in change transformation, whatever it might be. So they're very sort of like, I work on the business rather than in the business. And I think they're
you place yourself outside the system rather than consider yourself to be an integrated part of the system,
even though you're sat in the system.
Correct.
So that boundary work becomes very, very challenging. And I think when we think about the organization design of like change, a lot of the questions we have are, where do we put the incubator? Do we put it down the road, or do we put it in the same building? Do we front load or back load the change resistance? And often it comes down to questions of, will the current leadership team who are running the core business, to what extent are they on or off, the future strategy? So I think you make a lot of decisions very quickly, actually, when you start structuring how you want to do change and growth. or however else you want to call it, based on a sort of an assessment of what your current bench strength is. And then you build accordingly. And whichever way you do it, there's consequences. It casts
Yeah.
a long shadow. And I think it's probably better knowing the shadow that you're casting than not knowing it at all. So
Yeah.
there's some value in doing it in-house and in the same building. But the minute it starts to get a scale of its own, I think you quickly find people who are swashbuckling, thinking that they're much smarter than the client, and they don't identify with the client's future. They identify with their own brilliance.
Yeah.
So that's a challenge, right? I mean, that's a challenge that you've really got to manage carefully.
Yeah.
But those internal change roles are brilliant accelerator experiences for talent in the core business.
Yeah.
And if you can sort of like populate them, if you can cross-fertilize those groups, so you've got a bit of the in group, a bit of the new group, and a bit of the sometimes you just need someone to hold up the mirror and bring something totally radical to the party. Otherwise, there's no inspiration.
Yeah.
So I think it's a real mix. It looks different every time, Dirk. I think it's a fascinating question,
Yeah.
and I'm really looking forward to the next one. Because they're all different.
Yeah. No, that's true. Hey, one of the things you said earlier that was an interesting one is what is the difference between leading and changing? And is it not, let's say, an integrated part of a leader's role to basically change and bring change, rather than to ensure that current initiatives and operations, etc., are running well. In your book, you also highlight the concept that some companies, install chief acceleration officers. Uh, I must honestly say that I'm quite cynical about the concept because it almost looks like, I see mentally, I see a CEO, I see a couple of business unit managers, and then I have someone with a kind of, a head up like chief acceleration officer, and I have an idea, well, if there's any recipe for discussions about mandates and unclear boundaries, then we have it here. So I guess my first question is, what is your take on that one, on let's say having a separate chief acceleration officer? And my second question is, if you were, implementing such a role, what kind of boundary conditions would you need to put in place, and what kind of other conditions to make this a successful exercise?
Yeah. So and I poke fun a little bit at that particular
Yeah,
that particular title, right? That's the name of the chapter, and I point a little bit to the evolution of these C-level roles that are not quite line functions, but are more in the transformative space. So, and we've seen this for years. I mean, if you are not going back too far, but if you think of the concept of commercial perhaps being a hybrid of sales and marketing, or the idea of having a growth division in addition to a sort of core business unit
yeah,
sort of structure. Then you get I guess the technology piece has brought in the chief technology officer or the chief digital officer, and who then has to sit across other estates of technology. So almost like the run, IT is often thought of as run. Some of the core sort of like knowledge areas such as data or product, and a lot of these relate to different theories of organization design and different sort of stages of technology maturity and evolution in the business. But we keep playing with the role that's a little bit different to the rest, especially where the CEO perhaps feels that their attention is directed in too many different directions. Simultaneously, I've got to manage up, I've got to manage out, I need somebody to help manage down. So they might appoint one individual to play that joining of dots role. They might also use that person to take some heat, to draw some of the heat of change internally, so that the CEO is allowed to continue with, daily activities, frankly, because it can be very difficult. And again, it depends a little bit what you're inheriting, what's the situation, who have you got in those roles,
hmm
and how do you want to do it. You asked me if I think it's a good idea or not. I think it probably is born out of necessity,
hmm
and I think it usually immediately causes issues from the get go.
yeah,
So the boundary considerations are, well, what's the rules of the game then when the disruptor is kind of in the room,
yeah,
and what's the what's the anxiety level now that
yeah,
I've got somebody who's trying to essentially make my
Yeah,
might
I'm running this
might be
business.
redundant.
I have, let's say, a revenue, profit, let's say, and product responsibility, and now someone is going to recommend me to make changes. Yeah,
Yeah, but whether you sort of make it an official role,
yeah,
I think what you often find is that somebody on that leadership team is taking
yeah,
that responsibility for looking, forward,
yeah,
and for sort of making some necessary changes happen. So it might be your CFO, it might be somebody in the commercial business or the technology
yeah,
business.
yeah.
So
But
it's still it's yeah.
I think that's a very interesting, and I think a very true thought. You need someone who clearly brings in, let's say, external perspectives, but also, let's say, inconvenient truth.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
There is that inconvenient truth, isn't there? Which might be that we're very happy sort of delivering daily results.
yeah,
But when are we actually? You just reminded me. Often it can be it can be the person responsible for strategy that
yeah,
is also doing that sort of like outside in view.
yeah,
Where are we going? What needs to happen? But often a lot of these sort of knowledge leaders, they don't have the necessary organizational clout uh, to get the people who run the really big chunks of the business.
yeah,
They've got the momentum, they've got the budget, they might have the P&L, they
yeah,
might have the resources. As we know,
yeah,
that creates a center of gravity that's very hard to knock off course.
yeah,
And so sometimes you need somebody of equal sort of stature and mass who
yeah,
can help shift the business's direction.
yeah,
And just having sort of like an individual contributor reporting to the CEO who's got a McKinsey background, it might not be enough. You might actually need to have a proper center of gravity internally.
yeah, yeah. I think so too, because I think that there are an infinite number of companies where you have a CEO with, let's say, various business unit leaders, and the poor CEO is basically then the one, trying to instill change, and the business leader have an idea. Well, as long as we keep, as long as we support each other, good luck. So
Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I see that. I see that. Hey, what I like in your book is your quote of Rachel Botsman, and I will read out that quote. And she says, trust is like energy; it doesn't get destroyed; it merely changes form, and it flows to different actors and institutions. I love that frame, and that analogy. So, if you think about trust in change management and transformation processes, where do you think it flows if change management is not handled effectively?
Yeah. I'm also a big fan of Rachel Botsman's work. So her definition of trust, by the way, is a confident relationship with the unknown,
Hmm.
which I think
Yeah,
is super for our times. And yeah, absolutely, you're right. It doesn't disappear. It's like energy; it dissipates. It goes other directions. And I mean, invariably, it's going. It's it. Our trust is no longer with authority or leadership figures, with government, with the police, with media outlets. It's more with peers, with people who we think we have some sort of kindred spirit with. So we're in it together. Uh, I think in organizations, quite often it goes sideways, downwards, and outwards. Fundamentally, when we stop believing what leaders are saying, or where it's going, and you can see that. I see that in let's talk about those three sort of energy directions. So you quickly find out who your friends are in an organization when everything becomes a bit topsy turvy.
hmm,
And you often can see the erosion of the sort of the leadership gap between the leader and their team direct reports under harsh conditions. And it's almost like they're all in it together. It's almost like you have this sort of shop steward mentality of we're all employees that are being treated badly by the owner. Even though one of you is actually the boss of that team, you're the leader of that team. You're supposed to be, helping others see the way forward. But because you all feel sort of suppressed, then you see that sort of erosion. So often, actually, small teams can get really tight, can form really strong relationships, but it's no longer that sort of leadership manager direct report relationship. And then,
hmm,
of course, we go external. I mean, I think a lot of relationships with headhunters and recruiters are born during times of organizational stress.
yeah,
That's when you start asking yourself, is there a safe haven, safe
yeah,
harbor? Should I go somewhere else? And whether you do or you don't, you start really reaching out to externals to give you perspective on the internal.
yeah,
And they will often tell you, yes, you're right. What you're experiencing is pretty severe, and your business has a reputation as being a real toxic, poorly managed workplace. And that's
Yeah.
kind of music to your ears when you're on the inside. It's like, yes, it's not me. I knew it. And I think those relationships sort of are allowed to strengthen at the expense of, believing what the leaders are saying. And I have an example of this myself when I worked for an organization where they would do the quarterly financial results to the market. They would broadcast it from inside the business.
Mm-hmm.
And it had been a really difficult year. We'd been told essentially that, we were going out of business fairly soon. Our results were disappointing, and we had to cut jobs every quarter. And then we got to the broadcast for the results to the analysts and to the stock market community. And all of a sudden, they'd found numbers and KPIs that were incredibly positive and rosy. And I remember we were all in the auditorium listening to this broadcast together, and we were looking at each other to say, "Are they talking about the same company?" Oh, because you've been beating us up all year, and yet here you are. You've got a positive spin for the externals. And I remember a lot of us went for what we called a "what the hell" beer after that. Like, we
Yeah.
need a drink, and we need to say, "What the hell happened there?"
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden we don't trust the guy holding the microphone. He's been
Yeah.
spinning one message to us and another message externally. Are we just instruments to be abused? Are we given different targets to the
Yeah.
external ones? And I think a lot of the what comes from that sort of misman. I know it's not mismanagement as such, because if you've ever managed a sales team, you've got to have your commitments up and your commitments down. They might be different.
Yeah.
But if the reality and the experience inside and outside a company are totally different, there's only one thing that's going to happen. That's the trust is going to erode and it's going to escape.
Yeah. Yeah. Another interesting aspect, which I thought was rather thought-provoking, is you're highlighting in the book that crisis can be opportunities to structurally change companies for the better. And you quote, let's say, something you were very close to. That was the infamous cyber attack on Maersk. Do you have any process suggestions for organizations to use a crisis to identify and implement some of these changes?
Yeah, so that's a good question. That was the question I sort of asked myself when I interviewed people that
Hmm.
were involved from the
Yeah.
technology side of things. And I think what I took away from that was that a crisis is actually a great opportunity for good leadership to shine. And I can't talk about what is the process for responding to a crisis. I'm sure it looks different always, but what stood out there was a leader taking a kind of a people centric approach to it, very much inspired actually by sort of the agile methodology of team of
Hmm.
teams, recognizing there was a lot to do by but to involve a lot of people in a structured way, and for the leader to be very engaged and hands on. And I think when we reflect a few years later on what happened during that period, was that, and it's actually one of the lovely quotes in the book, is that one of the individuals said at the end, "I really miss coming to work and doing the impossible."
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
that's how it felt for them
Yeah.
once everything had calmed down. So I asked Adam, who was the CTO at the time, why do you think that was? And I think it was, people just felt very involved, very included, very cared for, and they had purpose. And it's like you can apply that to business as usual or a crisis. It's almost like it's just very intentional, intense leadership. Now, you can't run at that sort of speed all the time, but there's some clues there to what really makes people, thrive at work. And and there's no doubt that organization's technology was able to take leapfrogs in its evolution through a very short but sharp period of time. So I always think that the answer to the question is, great leadership is the right process in a crisis, and if you can sort of involve and take people with you on that journey, then
Hmm.
that a lot of those people learned and grew enormously during that
Yeah.
experience.
Yeah. If you look at our current times, right? We go through a very very interesting period. I think I I basically was formed at the end of the Cold War, right? And we thought we had it made, right? In the sense of, the wall of Berlin fell. Fujikawa wrote this famous book, The End of History. So we basically thought we had arrived. Now,
Mhm.
if you look at our current society with, COVID-19 pandemics, which we all associated with things earlier in the 20th century, we have wars, we have conflicts, we have we have technology that is incredibly disruptive. And in your book, you quote Mohammed El Arian,
Mhm.
who described the period in we are in as a permacrisis, and I really love that statement, because I think it's very true. But if you think about the fact that we live in a kind of perma crisis, does it also mean that we have to step away from classic change management projects? Because if you look at the approach that we take to change management quite often, then it can be compared to what were waterfall projects in the period of IT, right? We started with spending weeks defining our requirements, and then months defining the design, and then approximately 3/4 of a year to basically program it and then go live. So should we basically look for different forms of change management, and maybe get some inspiration from agility, Scrum, more of the modern concepts of change and development?
Yeah. Well, I also love that permacrisis expression, but I included it also as a bit of a health warning. And I think that's either in or very close to a chapter on resilience. Again, it's the idea that if you constantly listening to the news on crisis, then that will have an effect on your sense of sort of stability and resilience and well-being. Um, but of course, you need to acknowledge that some elements of that are true, and not everything that we talk about from sort of the agile manifesto and technology uh, is analogous to I think what we're talking about. But then I just gave you an example of leadership in a cyber attack where I described a sort of a team
Yeah.
of teams approach as being successful. So it's not without without help. But I what was different in that situation, I think, was that you had both things. You had a leader who essentially was holding all the cards because needs must. A cyber attack for a company that's then essentially brought it to a halt all of a sudden can pretty much do whatever they need to do, and has a methodology for organizing a team to get it done. So you can't say that wasn't a control tower centralization
Hmm.
sort of structure either.
No.
It was kind of both, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think the control, the anxiety level of the leaders. This is why I often see actually the agile approach doesn't work. Is because the idea of ceding control and letting other people's experimentation and fail when I'm not really involved and I can't really explain what's going on to my superiors. That doesn't sit very easily with leaders during times of change either. So maybe it is this connectedness. I do get nervous a bit about the control tower approach, the idea of centralizing all change know-how in one place.
Yeah.
And certainly there's something about a decentralized approach where we all have context of what's going on. We're all skilled and tooled up in how we can make this go better. But I guess it's the connectedness, isn't it? I mean, you've got to have what can make waterfall work is that you can actually get big things achieved.
Orchestrated and done. Yeah, yeah. You cannot
Yeah,
you cannot build an airport in an agile manner. You need to have a kind
that's
of
right.
idea where you actually go to plan it, and how big it's gonna be, and yeah.
Yeah, so maybe actually that's a nice expression. So maybe actually it is the team of teams concept is actually pretty strong. I just know that when you say agile in organizations, a lot of the time that's interpreted as, oh great, I can just get on and do it.
Hmm.
Whereas, of course, everybody has a version of I need to get on and do it.
Yeah,
And if we're not updating each other, then the thing doesn't work.
yeah. No, absolutely. And another very interesting concept, because but one of the things I loved about your book is the amount of, let's say, concepts and authors, etc., you quote, which of course puts me as an interviewer in a wonderful position that it can just basically cherry pick, elements that particularly appeal to me. And one of those cherries is you quote Casio, and he states that we need to develop behavioral skills to meet the BANI world in which we live, and BANI obviously stands for brittle, anxious, nonlinear, and comprehensible. And it's got an interesting concept. He said, look, brittleness should be addressed by resilience and slack, anxiety by empathy and mindfulness, non-linearity by context and flexibility, and incomprehensibility by transparency and intuition. Um, could you perhaps illustrate these points with examples from your own experience? So, if you take, for instance, brittleness, addressing that by resilience and slack, what does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I also loved this quote. I mean,
Yeah.
I had you say what it obviously meant. I had not come across it
No.
before researching the book. So I used VUCA a lot,
Yeah.
and then Barney
No.
essentially was
At certain
the.
moment, I'm quite
Hmm,
adept. So at a certain moment, it was like Fuka is old. We're all Bani now, and I still
that's it.
try to find the exact difference, but that's okay.
What I liked about the Barney one is this idea of some suggestions for how you might
Yeah.
conquer it. So yeah, so the brittleness. So the brittleness. So I'm working with an organisation at the moment where I use the word fragile. The fragility
Yeah.
of certain individuals was becoming very obvious to me, and I suppose it was this idea, resilience and slack. So I use slightly different words. I mean, I talk about resilience as the ability to bounce back and take advantage of opportunities in the book. And for me, that conjures up this resourcefulness idea of um, being a bit creative and a bit entrepreneurial. So not being
Hmm.
sort of like constrained, which I think is powerful. And I would also say slack. I would actually sort of turn around into this idea of spaciousness, which I also talk about in the book. So are there people that you work with under difficult circumstances that actually the experience is quite different to more stress, more load, more work? But these are the people who help you think, breathe, connect with your body, and be creative. And there's an interesting piece in the book where John Higgins and Megan Wright, who write about spaciousness. John interviews me and one of my colleagues about our spacious relationship to try and understand it better. So it's odd where I sort of become a subject. I become a research subject in my own book at that point. And the awareness that came for me was find people that you can work with in difficult conditions where you can still bring the thinking, the connectedness, and the I suppose the well-being piece. And what I realized was underpinning the relationship, what made that relationship work in that way, was the philosophy of it's Martin Buber's positive self-regard for others.
Hmm.
So the difference between an I-it and an I-thou relationship. So a lot of people in change and business today have very much an I-it. So I'm
Yeah.
hiring you, Rupert, to fire 500 people by March.
Yeah.
Okay, okay, great. Sorry, I took the job. Or when March comes, that's it. That's the last I want to talk to you. An I-thou relationship might be: we get to March, you do the job, you do it well, and we're working together on something else. We're building understanding,
Yeah.
relationship. We're becoming friends. We're becoming
Hmm.
mentors. We're becoming coaches. We're building relationship. And I realized actually my approach and what I was missing and looking for in my work life was much more of an I-thou connection. So I don't mind doing difficult things, and I'll do them well, but I want to have that sense that I'm building professional friendship at the same
Yeah.
time. Um, so that's quite a large answer to why I think that the response to brittleness needs to be in that philosophy of how you
Hmm.
connect with others and how you look after yourself.
Yeah.
Um,
And if I may pick another one that I
mm,
found very interesting was the non-linearity one, which could be addressed by context and flexibility. Do you have any
mm.
examples or illustrations of that one?
I do. I do. I'm helping an organisation at the moment rethink how it does goal setting
Hmm.
in light of a new strategy and in light of changing and uncertain economic conditions. And what we're experimenting with is a shortening of the time frame of the sort of the planning horizon. But because if I think back to my early days at Procter and Gamble, we used to do 3 to 5 year brand strategy plans and then update them every year. Could you imagine doing a 3 to 5 year plan now? I
No.
mean, no, it feels a little
No.
bit. It feels a little
No.
bit academic, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
but the planning skill is still necessary, because if you don't plan to an extent, how do you focus? How do you figure out what is essential and not essential? How do you allocate resource? How do you have a conversation next week that said, how did you get on? How can you get better? And what's important now? So we're very much compressing the time frame, so that we feel a little bit more control, and it's still planning, but it's much more flexible, much more agile, I suppose. But this is not a technology company. This is
No.
an asset business where that sort of agile wouldn't really work.
Yeah.
But shortening the time frame to say what's important now, because we want to be able to take advantage of opportunities in the market. I mean,
Yeah.
if you think of how any business needs to outperform
Yeah.
the industry or the stock market. So if you're not taking advantage of opportunities personally and organizationally, you're not thriving. So I think that's a lovely response to non-linearity, because it kind of actually invokes almost like that creative and entrepreneurial sense of, I was doing X, but now I'm doing Y because that makes more sense.
Yeah.
And so it's not almost like, oh no, he's changed the goalpost again. It's like there's something else that, and then we can reward ourselves for success. So I think that's sort of the way I'm helping organizations think of the non-linearity. I would also say, actually, this it links to incomprehensibility. Why people often get really sidetracked by changes is because they can't see it coming, and people aren't describing the bigger picture.
Hmm.
And I think we often assume maybe that we all work in companies that might be listed, that might have to set goals and might have to communicate them externally, but that's not always the case. A lot of businesses either don't think that's necessary, or haven't done the planning, and certainly won't share it. So for a lot of to make sense of what's going on, I think, is a leader's job. But a lot of leaders have their hands tied behind the back because of the metrics that are chosen, the privacy over results,
Hmm.
or just the
Yeah.
fact that, as you know, Dirk, there's a lot of numbers in business, but they don't all add up.
Yeah.
A lot of the numbers aren't actually that helpful. And so a big job of leadership now is just making sense of what's going on, and what to do next.
Yeah. Yeah. Leadership starts to become more and more sense making. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's a very, very true point. Hey, finally, and we cannot escape that, artificial intelligence. Um, how do you think that artificial intelligence will enhance our change management capabilities, and can it help us increase the chances of success of change management programs?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, so I avoided generative AI when I wrote my book. I had to put
Hmm.
myself like on an island, technologically speaking,
Yeah.
and say I'm gonna avoid it. I want this to be my own work. So any errors in the book I own. What I've noticed, a lot of people who share like a people-centric philosophy, when they talk about AI, it's often from the stance of defensiveness. It's like,
Hmm.
you can't take the person away from this; it's too complicated. I had an experience recently though where I recognized that some people actually really put a lot of trust. We talked about trust earlier. They put a lot of trust in the technology, and they actually ask questions to their AI, their bot, their whatever is their sort of large language model of choice. They ask. It's almost like they are asking questions to the technology that ideally they would be asking to a therapist or to a trusted friend or to a coach, but they're not, and they weren't before. So this is not like, I'm not talking about the coaching industry needs to worry because everybody's going to go to online coaching. I'm not saying that. I don't think. I'm saying that there are people who weren't using coaching before that are getting some coaching benefits from technology today,
Yeah.
and that made me think slightly differently about the value and the application of technology. Because I think, essentially, if it allows you to interrogate a body of knowledge with the problems that you're faced with today, then that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
We have to be careful what's
Yeah,
been
yeah,
suggested.
and I think it's definitely the good idea. I think the only thing is I think people need to distinguish that part that everything that AI generates requires discretion in terms of interpretation. It's like I think where it goes wrong. I think wherever you see recognized productivity value, but remember that, let's say this is an artificial LLM created answer where you basically as a human being should still interpret whether that's reliable, whether it still makes sense, or rather you take it at face value.
Yeah, yeah, but you just reminded me of somebody I met during the research program called Roger Steer. He's called Roger Steer, and he goes by the moniker of the corporate philosopher. And he really got me thinking differently. I asked him once on a panel, "What's the critical skill we're going to need to be competitive in the future?"
Yeah,
And his response was moral reasoning.
yeah,
And it
yeah.
really struck me because I was expecting him to say Python
No,
or
no, no, no.
some coding language, but moral reasoning. And he had a lovely expression where he held up a knife, a really big knife, and you have a visceral reaction. I had a visceral reaction. Oh, you can't put knife. This is a workplace. You can't hold up a knife. That's scary, frightening, threatening. And his point was, it's a tool. It's an instrument. To a chef or a butcher, it's a necessary tool of trade. It can be used for good. In the wrong hands, of course, it's a weapon. It can be used for evil. And in some ways, the technology, whatever technology is, today we talk about tech and we mean large language models and generative AI, but any technology we've ever had
Yeah.
and will ever have, it can be used for good or for bad, right? So I think I think it can enhance the change management capabilities. I think it can also, send us all for a toss if we conclude that therefore we don't need the humans who are trying to influence leaders on what's the right approach. Why do we need that now? We've got Chat GPT. Then I think
Yeah.
we're heading the wrong direction.
Hey, Rupert, I learned a lot during our conversation. Thank you so much for attending the podcast and participating in the interview.
Well, thank you, Dirk. I've really enjoyed your podcast. I've enjoyed even your very first episode. Really got me switched on to the philosophy and psychology of change. Thank you so much, Dirk. It's been a pleasure.
Super. It's been a pleasure. See you.
See you.